In 1851, Atlanta, Georgia, a midwife named Edith Larchwood was found kneeling in her garden with dirt caked beneath her fingernails and a lace infant bonnet clenched in her fist, stained with something too dark to be milk. She was barefoot, her long skirts soaked at the hem and her expression eerily vacant. Neighbors had always admired her patience and quiet demeanor, especially with difficult births in poor districts. But beneath her porch, local authorities uncovered a crude ledger wrapped in oilcloth, listing 47 dates and initials, each matched to a child never registered with the city. Between 1846 and 1856, Atlanta had no standardized birth records, and many enslaved or indigent families relied solely on midwives like Edith. The summer of 1851 was blistering, with rot lingering in alleyways and church basements overrun with orphans. A July census count revealed a discrepancy of 31 infants across 2 counties. Why did no one ask what happened to the missing children? Edith Larchwood was trusted among working-class women, known for her clean linens, steady hands, and near-silent footsteps across wooden floors. But an 1851 property survey listed multiple irregular mounds in her backyard, and a coroner's journal noted an odor inconsistent with mere earth, prompting the first formal excavation. In the early spring of 1851, Mrs. Adelaide Krause, a widow who lived 3 parcels south of the Larchwood property, filed a complaint with the city magistrate about the persistent stench rising through her open windows. Her letter, written in practiced formal script, described a sickly sweetness, like bruised fruit left to boil under the floorboards. She assumed at first that the odor came from a nearby tannery or a spoiled grain sack at the neighboring bakery. But by her second letter, dated March 14th, she named Edith Larchwood directly, writing, "It is strongest near her fence, particularly after rain. I have closed my windows despite the warmth." At the time, Atlanta's westward expansion had just begun to brush against the farmlands once considered outskirts. Streets were rutted and uneven, dust clung to hems and nostrils alike. Nearer to the center, new brick buildings announced the city's ambitions. But in neighborhoods like Shanty Ward, midwives remained more trusted than physicians, especially among the Irish, the freedmen, and the poor whites who could not afford clinic visits or formal burials. Edith Larchwood's name was listed in the 1850 city medical roster under non-credentialed domestic practitioners. The designation carried no real authority, but it allowed her to avoid prosecution for practicing without a license. Most saw her as useful, unobtrusive, and decent. She lived alone, which was unusual but not scandalous. A few whispered that she had once been engaged to a Union Telegraph inspector who died of lockjaw, but Edith never confirmed it. She wore grey shawls year-round and carried a black parasol even in overcast weather. She kept to herself, but not unpleasantly so. Local children remembered the shape of her garden, perfectly squared, never overgrown, with white stones arranged around its edges like the teeth of a comb. The soil was always freshly turned, as if waiting. In early May, a 12-year-old errand boy named Elias Dupree was asked to deliver a tin of lard to Miss Larchwood's door, payment for services rendered to a local washerwoman who had given birth days earlier. Elias, a lanky boy with scabbed knuckles and a loose tooth, later told his schoolmate that he'd heard whimpering from the backyard. He hadn't thought much of it until he glanced through a gap in the garden fence and saw Edith kneeling in the soil, elbows deep, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. She was alone, and yet speaking, or praying, to something in the ground. The boy didn't wait for change or thanks. He dropped the tin on the stoop and ran. That same week, city gravedigger and records assistant Jonah Bell noted a pattern that made him pause. 3 separate infant burial requests had been made by proxy, with no formal name for the child and no priest or next of kin present. All 3 had listed Edith Larchwood as the attending midwife. The burial papers were signed with different marks, an X, a crooked circle, and an uneven left-handed loop, suggesting the proxies were either illiterate or falsified. Bell wrote a margin note beside the 3rd entry. No church rites. Same midwife, same day. The cemetery accepted the fees regardless. Throughout that summer, the odor worsened. Bees clustered along the Larchwood eaves. Cats refused to cross her threshold. A mail carrier claimed his horse shied violently every time they passed her gate, refusing to step near the eastern hedgerow. In his log, he wrote, "She has nothing rotting outside. Yet the smell clings like it is coming from underneath." On June 3rd, Mrs. Krause approached City Constable Merrin Fulk outside the apothecary on Whitehall Street. She was not the sort of woman who embarrassed easily, but Fulk's report notes her hands were shaking. She pressed a rolled envelope into his coat and insisted he read it in private. The note inside contained a single sentence. "The ground behind the midwife's home moves when she's done working." Fulk was known to be methodical, not easily roused. He waited 5 days before conducting a cursory check. By then, summer storms had begun. The soil behind Edith's home was wet and loosely packed. Fulk knocked at the front door under a grey sky, coat soaked, boots caked in yellow mud. Edith answered, dry as bone. She offered him ginger water, which he declined. According to Fulk's written recollection, she smiled politely but never once asked why he had come. He made no mention of the backyard, unsure how to phrase suspicion without warrant. That same week, a carpenter named Tobias Elvin was called to replace damaged flooring in the home of Louisa Bellamy, who had given birth just 10 days earlier. Edith Larchwood had overseen the delivery. The child had not survived. Louisa told Tobias that she hadn't seen the baby's body since the morning it stopped breathing, and that Edith had promised the proper steps would be taken. While prying up floorboards near the hearth, Tobias found something unexpected beneath the edge joist, a soiled cloth bundle tightly knotted and wet to the touch. He didn't open it. Instead, he carried it out to the stoop and left it near Louisa's basin. When she unwrapped it hours later, she found it contained a fragment of baby's clothing, stained and stiff, along with a metal clasp that did not belong to her household. She told no one. Her husband had already returned to the rail line. There was no money for inquiry. On June 19th, Constable Fulk filed a formal notice of unusual complaint with the City Board of Health, citing repeated concerns from residents and a possible issue of unsanctioned burials or unsafe sanitation. The document was received but delayed in review, as half the board had travelled to Savannah in anticipation of the summer port census. Fulk made a personal visit to the Office of Land Use to review the property logs. What he found disturbed him. The Larchwood parcel had been subdivided in 1848, just after Edith acquired it. 2 additional plots, technically extensions of her garden, had never been properly taxed. No inspection had been recorded since the purchase. Fulk petitioned for a land survey under public health pretext and was granted a limited visit under magistrate oversight. The inspection took place July 2nd, under high sun and thick humidity. Edith did not protest, but followed closely behind the men as they measured and marked. They noted irregular subsidence near the hedgerow and documented 3 indentations in the soil, shallow but precise, as if something had been buried and later settled. One of the assistants, a student clerk named Aldous Green, claimed he saw a section of earth pulse as if something beneath it had shifted. Later that day, Green returned to the site alone and took 3 clippings from the garden edge. He wrapped them in oilskin and recorded their location. When pressed by Fulk later, he admitted he wanted to know why the leaves had no insects and smelled faintly of iron. By mid-July, 2 more women came forward anonymously through the local parish to say their infants had died during home birth, but were never returned to them for burial. In both cases, Edith Larchwood had taken responsibility. In both cases, no death certificate had been filed. Constable Fulk requested exhumation of the garden site, but his petition was denied pending further evidence. That evidence arrived 3 days later, in the form of a rainstorm and a collapsed garden wall. The storm that hit Atlanta on the night of July 21st, 1851, began with a low, metallic sky and ended with uprooted trees and flooded alleys. The following morning, neighbors emerged to find their yards littered with snapped branches and sodden laundry. Along Adderhold Lane, Edith Larchwood's property bore the worst of it. Her east garden wall, a narrow partition of stacked limestone and clay mortar, had caved in under the weight of waterlogged soil. The collapse left a gaping wound in the earth and exposed a section of her yard not meant to be seen. Constable Fulk arrived by noon. His boots sank in the churned soil, the air wet and sour. The breach revealed what appeared to be 5 separate mounds, each roughly the size and shape of a child's coffin, though no coffins were visible. The roots of the elderberry bushes lining the fence had twisted around and beneath the depressions, as if trying to hold them in place. Fulk instructed his clerk to begin sketches while he paced the garden's perimeter, notebook open, raincoat still dripping. Edith stood at her door with a checked cloth in her hands, drying one spoon over and over. She said nothing. When Fulk nodded to approach, she stepped back into the threshold but did not invite them in. Her face remained placid, her hands methodical. When asked if she could explain the irregular formations, she replied, "Some mothers prefer closeness, even in sorrow." Fulk asked what she meant. She offered no further clarification. A public health inspector was dispatched under emergency order. His notes, still preserved in the city archives, detail the first recorded disturbance of the garden. At a depth of 11 inches in the second mound, his trowel struck what he described as a length of cotton swaddling, tightly rolled, faint odor of sour milk and lye. Beneath the swaddling was a partial jawbone, smaller than a chicken's. Human. They halted the dig and marked the area for official exhumation. The site was cordoned by rope, and 2 watchmen were assigned to remain overnight until a county mortician could be summoned. That evening, the first whisper of the word graveyard circulated through the block. By morning, 3 more women had visited the parish priest, Father Kemper, and given statements under promise of anonymity. Each had lost a child during birth between 1848 and 1850. All 3 said they had seen the child alive for only moments. All 3 said Edith had taken the infant from their arms, offering soft reassurances and a promise of interment in a place with flowers. None had received a burial location. None had seen a death certificate. All were too poor to insist. One of them, Ellen Stowe, a laundress from the Canal District, told the priest she had returned to Edith's home days later, asking to see where her son had been buried. Edith had refused to open the gate. "He is already at rest," she had said. "Do not disturb what has settled." Constable Fulk requested authorization for a full dig. Permission was granted within 24 hours. On July 25, 1851, city workers and a team of 3 medical examiners began excavation. What they uncovered confirmed the worst fears of the city board. Over the course of 6 hours, they unearthed 17 separate burial sites, each containing tightly wrapped infant remains. No coffins, no markers, no documentation. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition. Some were swaddled in muslin, others in burlap or household linen. One was bound in a length of curtain fabric. All were buried shallow, barely more than a foot deep. Each exhumation was logged. Photographs did not yet exist in police documentation, but hand-drawn renderings were made by clerk Aldous Green, who had remained on site. His illustrations are clinical and small, but unmistakable. One of the examiners, Dr. Thomas Renfrey, a former army surgeon, noted something that unsettled him deeply. The positioning of the bodies showed no signs of formal arrangement or ritual. Instead, they appeared hurriedly concealed, sometimes with limbs folded to fit the narrow trench. In his written report, he stated, "This was not a burial ground. This was a concealment site." By evening, a crowd had gathered near the fence. Rumors fed themselves. Whispers turned to open speculation. Edith did not emerge. The following morning, city magistrates arrived with a summons and a preliminary charge of unlawful burial. They found Edith in her kitchen, boiling water and slicing root vegetables. She did not resist. When asked to gather personal items, she selected only a shawl and a parcel of dried herbs. As she was escorted from the house, she paused at the threshold, turned her head slowly and said to no one in particular, "I never harmed them, not once. I only kept them close." She was held without bond. The press caught wind of the arrest within a day. The July 27th edition of the Atlanta Register featured a single column on the second page titled "Grave Discovery in Garden of Midwife." The article refrained from direct accusations, but cited a disturbing number of unregistered infant remains and irregularities in public health filings. Public reaction was divided. Some, especially in the poorer wards, expressed disbelief. Edith had been a lifeline for those without access to hospitals or priests. Others demanded full investigation and a citywide review of all midwife activities. By the first week of August, A review of Edith's personal effects turned up a notebook bound in soft leather, hidden behind a loose board in her pantry. The notebook contained a list of 47 entries, each beginning with a date, followed by initials and a brief note. Cold at birth, did not nurse, too soon, took air, then quiet. The final entry, dated July 16, 1851, read simply, M.W. Perfect and still. No surnames, no signatures, no proof. A formal search of the rest of the property was ordered. The cellar contained nothing suspicious. The attic, however, revealed a shelf of tightly folded blankets, each labeled in faint pencil script. The names were unfamiliar, possibly invented, possibly borrowed. A trunk beneath the shelf contained items typical of childbirth: clamps, oil, linen, a jar of powder marked calm. But at the bottom of the trunk was a child's rattle, still clutched in a tiny linen glove. Constable Fulk, now leading the inquiry, compiled a dossier that included statements from 11 families, the list of 47 initials, and the findings from the garden. The mortician confirmed that none of the infants had received proper burial rites. No known causes of death could be conclusively determined, but none bore visible injury. Word spread to surrounding counties. 2 families from Decatur arrived, claiming they too had trusted Edith with a stillbirth in 1849 and had never received a body. The pressure mounted. Public hearing was scheduled. Edith Larchwood was moved to the county jailhouse, where she was placed under observation. The matron assigned to her noted that she ate little, slept in short bursts, and often whispered what sounded like lullabies, though no child was present. When asked directly whether she had buried the children in her garden, she said yes. When asked why, she replied, the mothers could not. Someone had to. On August 5, 1851, Reverend Daniel Brisby of the Southern Episcopal Office arrived in Atlanta unannounced. Sent by the Ecclesiastical Council in Charleston, he carried with him a sealed directive marked Inquiry, Burial Irregularities. Tall, with a fading scar above his left eyebrow from a church collapse in 1839, Brisby was known for his ability to speak plainly to magistrates and laborers alike. His first stop was the county jail. The matron handed him Edith Larchwood's daily logbook without protest. He read it in silence for over an hour, then requested to see her in person. She greeted him without rising from her cot. Her feet were bare. Her gaze, though calm, did not rise past his collar. Brisby's first written note after the meeting described her voice as level, practiced without resistance. He recorded that when he asked her whether she believed she had sinned, she responded, "The mistake was not in the burying. The mistake was in believing they would let me." Meanwhile, at the garden site, the exhumation efforts had stalled. On August 3rd, 2 days prior to Brisby's arrival, 3 of the original dig team withdrew from the assignment, citing illness. One man, Thomas Ray, developed severe skin irritation and nausea after handling one of the burial wrappings. Another, Clements Varr, refused to return altogether. He claimed in a written statement that the soil is not natural. It breaks apart like dried meat, and there's something slick at the bottom that's not clay. Samples sent to the state medical office were returned without conclusion. 1 vial of earth was lost in transit. Around this time, discrepancies began appearing in the official list of remains. Clerk Aldous Green, tasked with cataloguing each exhumation, noted in his own log that 2 of the burial mounds previously identified now yielded only empty indentations. He personally recalled helping lift a swaddled form from one of them during the first week. Yet when revisited, the site showed no disturbance, and the tagged linen was missing from storage. Green raised the alarm with Constable Fulk, who dismissed it as clerical confusion. But Green persisted, submitting a notarized declaration affirming that he had sketched and documented at least 19 burial sites with physical evidence, yet only 17 could now be accounted for. No official response was filed. On August 7th, a new figure arrived in Atlanta. Edwin McTavish, a journalist from the Savannah Courier. He carried a notebook with wax-sealed pages and a remit from his editor to report plainly without embellishment. He visited the jailhouse that evening. The matron denied him entry, but he lingered outside and watched as Edith was escorted to the interior courtyard for her daily walk. She moved slowly, with the same gait described by witnesses who had seen her passing through alleys to reach birthing homes. McTavish would later write, "She bore the air of someone who had done nothing unusual, only something not spoken of aloud." His article appeared 2 days later, titled "The Quiet Woman and the Garden Grave." Though restrained, it drew significant attention. Letters poured into the Atlanta Register's offices from as far as Augusta and Macon. Several women asked whether it was possible to see the garden themselves. A man from Valdosta claimed he recognized one of the initials in the ledger as belonging to his niece, born in 1847 and never again spoken of by his sister. The growing pressure forced city officials to schedule a public hearing. It was set for August 21st. In the days leading up to the hearing, more inconsistencies surfaced. The parcel map submitted by the Office of Land Use now showed Edith's garden plots as subdivided only once, not twice, contradicting previous records. The second extension, where many of the mounds had been discovered, no longer appeared in official diagrams. Falk requested a recheck of the purchase deeds, only to find that the 1848 file had been removed from the records room and replaced with a newer copy, dated 1851 and marked "Reviewed and Corrected." Falk, already strained from the pace of the investigation, began documenting his suspicions in private. One such note, dated August 14th, read, "Somebody wants this portion of land scrubbed, and the evidence with it." That same day, Reverend Brisby received permission to review the recovered ledger in full. He spent 5 hours in the magistrate's office, comparing dates and cross-referencing parish records. A pattern emerged. Every third or fourth entry corresponded closely to the death of a mother during childbirth. Some were listed officially, others whispered among parish volunteers. In some cases, the infants had outlived the mothers by only hours. In one case, 3 days. Brisby underlined 3 entries in red and wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. No record of burial for any of these women. He took the ledger with him that night. The next morning, it was missing. The magistrate's clerk claimed no knowledge. Falk, infuriated, ordered a search of the Reverend's lodgings but found nothing. Brisby denied removing it. A new copy was reconstructed from Green's original notes, but at least 5 entries were lost permanently. On August 16th, a second journalist arrived, Hiram Beck from the Baltimore Gazette. More assertive than McTavish, he began interviewing neighbors, gravediggers, and anyone who had encountered Edith in a professional capacity. One of his most revealing conversations was with Mrs. Sabina Hargrove, a seamstress who had helped launder garments for poor households after deliveries. She recalled receiving small bundles of stained fabric from Edith on multiple occasions, always with the same instruction: "Clean, do not mend." She remembered the smell: sour milk, soot, and sometimes like a cold iron pan left in the rain. Hargrove assumed they were remnants from birth complications. She never questioned the lack of payment or the haste with which Edith departed. Beck published his piece under the title "Beneath the Linen," and for the first time, the term "serial burial" appeared in public discourse. The article stoked fury and fear. City Hall received anonymous threats. The county jail was surrounded by gawkers, and in one instance a small group of women clutching white baby bonnets in silent protest. Edith remained unmoved. When asked by her matron what she made of the attention, she answered only, "They weep now, but not when I held their hands." As the hearing approached, additional pressure mounted on the Office of Public Health. Dr. Renfrey submitted a follow-up report challenging his own initial conclusions. In it, he noted that several of the exhumed remains bore no signs of trauma or decay consistent with natural stillbirth. Some appeared fully formed, the umbilical stumps tied with experienced care. "It is not clear that all these children were born lifeless," he wrote. This prompted a crisis within the medical board. 3 members resigned their roles in the inquiry. One issued a statement to the Atlanta Register, writing, "The truth is larger than any one report and older than this city." With each passing day, Edith's silence gained weight. The contradictions around her only deepened the sense that something methodical had been concealed, not by malice, but by neglect, complicity, or both. On August 19th, with 2 days left before the hearing, Aldous Green returned to the burial site to prepare diagrams for court presentation. He carried with him the original garden sketches, but when he arrived, the area had been cleared. No rope. No markers, no mounds. The earth had been tilled. The garden was no longer a crime scene. Overnight, it had been stripped of its rope boundaries and flattening flags. The soil, freshly turned, bore neat furrows as if prepared for planting. Aldous Green stood in the center of the plot at mid-morning, clutching his sketches, unsure whether to begin shouting or documenting. No city workers were present, no guards. Only the rustle of wind through the hedgerow and the faint sound of a nearby cowbell drifting from a neighboring yard. He returned to City Hall in a fury, demanding an explanation. The magistrate's office claimed no authorization had been granted to disturb the site. Fulk's name had not been signed on any order. The only entry in the clearance log was a single notation written in unfamiliar hand. Garden maintenance approved. By request. No signature, no date. Green was told in measured tones to lower his voice. That same day, Reverend Brisby left Atlanta without notice. He boarded the early mail train south, carrying only a small satchel and declining to answer questions from the clerk who sold his ticket. According to the station porter, Brisby appeared agitated. He wore his collar backward, a detail noticed by several witnesses, and paced the platform muttering to himself. In his absence, a sealed envelope was found beneath the floorboards of his rented room. It was addressed to the Southern Episcopal Council, but never mailed. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smeared in one corner. It read, "There is no way to cleanse a city that feeds itself with forgetting." Her hands were not clean, but neither were ours. That evening, Fulk received an anonymous note slipped under his door. It bore no address, no salutation, only a sentence written in charcoal on coarse ledger paper. Ask about the hospital's ledger from May 1849. Fulk followed the lead. At Grady House Infirmary, one of the few facilities in the area with surviving records from that period, he located the intake log for late spring 1849. Most entries were routine: fever cases, work injuries, occasional cholera suspicion. Then, on May 19th, a sudden spike, 12 infant entries in a single 24-hour period, all listed as stillborn on arrival. No maternal names, all tagged with the same phrase, "delivered elsewhere." He inquired further. The nurse who had assisted in record preservation, Mrs. Temperance Willis, now retired, was brought in to consult. Her memory was failing, but when shown the entry page, she touched the edge of the parchment and whispered, "That's when they started bringing them in wrapped too tightly. No breathing room, no questions asked." Fulk pressed. She repeated only, "We didn't ask, we couldn't. Too many, too fast." The pattern matched Edith's ledger. Meanwhile, journalist Edwin McTavish returned to the jailhouse to attempt one final interview. This time the matron allowed it, perhaps out of weariness, or a growing sense that no statement would make sense of what was happening. McTavish sat with Edith for 12 minutes. He asked direct questions. She responded only twice. When asked if she had ever harmed a living child, she replied, "No one who cried was buried." When asked why she never notified the city about the deaths, she replied, "Would you have come for them?" McTavish's article, published the next day, did not include these quotes. Instead, he focused on the vanishing garden, the missing evidence, and the public's loss of confidence in every authority involved. His closing paragraph stated, "If the truth lives anywhere in this city, it lives in fear. The soil has been turned, but no one dares to say what was planted." On August 21st, the day of the public hearing, crowds lined the courthouse steps. Families came holding papers, blankets, even hand-drawn likenesses of infants they had lost. The courtroom was packed by the hour. Edith was escorted in under heavy guard, her expression unreadable. She wore the same grey shawl she had the day of her arrest. The proceedings began with statements from the city magistrate, the public health office, and Constable Fulk. When asked to summarize the findings, Fulk hesitated for the first time. His voice dropped. "There were remains. There are now fewer. The records do not match, and I can no longer say who is helping us and who is not." A silence settled over the chamber. A woman named Myra Lattimore was called as the first witness. She had given birth in 1850 under Edith's care. Her child died within the hour. She spoke calmly, hands folded, recounting how Edith had held the child gently, wrapped it, and promised a clean resting place. She wept only once when asked if she had ever seen the body again. "No," she said. But I believed her. She said he'd never be cold. The second witness, Dr. Thomas Renfrey, was questioned regarding his conflicting reports. When asked why his conclusions had changed, he replied, "Because someone is adjusting the truth around me. Because I saw what I saw and now I cannot prove it." The hearing spiraled. Questions were redirected, files could not be located. Aldous Green tried to submit his original sketches, only to be told they had already been entered into evidence. Yet the ones presented bore different markings and lacked his initials. By the end of the session, nothing conclusive had been established. That night, someone broke into the infirmary archives. The lock was forced. Only one file was taken, the 1849 ledger Fulk had reviewed days earlier. The pages were later found floating in the drainage ditch behind the building. Soaked through, ink bled into indecipherable clouds. Word of the theft spread fast. The Atlanta Register ran a single headline, "Evidence Drowned." The city's mood turned. Edith was transferred back to holding while the magistrates deliberated. No one claimed responsibility for the lost files, the altered maps, the garden's sudden clearing. The city clerk fell ill and was placed on leave. One witness retracted her testimony, claiming undue pressure. Others refused to speak further. In the following days, the garden site was sold. It was purchased quietly by a local merchant known to donate to political campaigns. Within a week, construction had begun on a toolshed and smokehouse. No additional exhumations were allowed. The area was declared closed. Constable Fulk, stripped of further investigative authority, submitted a letter of resignation on August 27th. In it, he wrote, "The silence here is stronger than the law, and it will bury more than bones if we let it." His letter was never published. On the morning of September 2nd, 1851, just as the case risked slipping into procedural silence, a carpenter named Elias Greer filed an urgent statement with the city registrar. Greer had been hired by the new property owner to inspect the foundations of the Larchwood house before its repurposing. What he found beneath the structure halted all plans. According to his affidavit, Greer entered the crawlspace under the kitchen floor expecting to clear out damp boards and inspect the joists. Instead, his lantern revealed a narrow passage, cut by hand, running 6 feet into the earth. The walls were reinforced with brick fragments and mortared stone, dry despite the late summer rains. The space was too low to walk, but wide enough to crawl. At the far end, he found a recess carved into the earth, large enough to kneel in. Inside that cavity lay a small wooden chest, nailed shut with initials carved faintly into the lid. EL authorities were notified immediately. Fulk, though no longer leading the investigation, was contacted and allowed to observe under magistrate supervision. The chest was carefully removed and placed on a table in the city records room. Its exterior was simple, unvarnished, aged by time and mold. It weighed less than expected. When the lid was pried open, silence fell across the room. Inside, laid with unnatural precision, were 23 cloth pouches. Each was tied with a red thread and labeled in faded graphite. The handwriting matched that in Edith's original ledger. The pouches varied in weight, but all were similar in size, each no larger than a loaf of bread. When unwrapped under controlled handling, the contents were revealed. Fragments of infant clothing, dried umbilical cords, cloth labels, and in some, minute bone fragments. No full skeletons, no complete remains. But enough to confirm the suspicion that what had been buried in the garden was only part of a larger effort. Among the pouches, authorities also discovered 2 items that unsettled even the most hardened officials. The first was a lock of dark hair, braided and fastened with a pin bearing a man's initials, RL. It did not match any known case in the files and bore no note of explanation. The second was a collection of folded slips of paper, water-stained and nearly unreadable. Upon careful unfolding, they revealed handwritten notes, each one beginning with a date and ending with a single phrase. April 3rd, 1847. She did not name him. June 9th, 1848, there was no cry. October 14th, 1849. Her eyes opened once, then closed. March 1st, 1850. She asked me to make it fast. None of the papers named the mother or child. None included full explanations, only dates and quiet finalities. Dr. Thomas Renfrey was called to review the chest's contents. His report, now preserved in the Georgia Historical Archives, described the pouches as a private reliquary of extreme emotional significance and possibly the most disturbing evidence of long-term intentional concealment I have seen in any domestic setting. When Fulk was allowed to speak privately with Greer, the carpenter confessed he nearly resealed the tunnel and told no one. "It was too quiet under there," he said. "The air had weight, like it had learned to keep secrets." The discovery reignited the inquiry. That same day, a team was dispatched to re-examine the Larchwood attic, which had been only cursorily reviewed during the initial sweep. They pulled the shelves away from the walls and tapped along the plaster with the butts of their lanterns. On the eastern wall, just behind the cloth stack labeled Rest, a thin wooden panel gave way. Behind it, a second compartment. No wider than a bureau drawer, the hidden space contained 6 wrapped bundles, each tied with a silk ribbon preserved from dust. Unlike the basement pouches, these were labeled not with dates, but with single letters. Inside each bundle were more items: drawings, tiny shoes, lockets, a child's spoon, a baptism cap. One bundle marked A contained a half-finished letter to no one. It read, "I kept her warm as long as I could. I gave her every name I knew." It was not enough. The reactions among the officials varied. Fulk stood silent, fists clenched at his sides. The city clerk who read the letter aloud refused to continue. One inspector stepped outside, muttering something about smoke in his lungs, though there had been no fire. Journalist McTavish was granted a brief supervised viewing. He later wrote, "These objects were not trophies. They were apologies too late to be heard." Word spread quickly. Within a day, a special session of the Public Health Board was called. Magistrates ordered all items to be held in protected evidence. A room at the courthouse was converted into temporary storage, with restricted access. 3 guards were assigned to it nightly. Despite this, 2 days later, a fire broke out in the adjacent wing. It was quickly contained, but not before smoke reached the records room. The Larchwood chest was unharmed, but the clerk's index containing names of midwife-assisted births from 1845 to 1850 was gone, burned to ash. An internal review declared it accidental. Fulk disagreed. In his private log he wrote, "The longer we pursue this, the less we are permitted to know." As the confrontation reached its peak, questions flooded city offices. Who had authorized the clearing of the garden? Why were ledgers missing or altered? Who stood to lose from a full accounting of the deaths? But no answers came. On September 5th, Edith was brought under heavy escort to the magistrate's office for an official deposition. She wore the same shawl, now visibly thinned. Her face was drawn, pale from confinement, yet she walked with calm steps, neither rushed nor fearful. Seated at the long table, she was asked to identify the items from the chest. She looked at each in turn, eyes steady. Then she said, every one of them had a name, but not always from their mothers. She was asked if she had taken the items from the bodies. She replied, "I kept what was left. The world took the rest." When asked if she had ever forged records, concealed burials, or taken responsibility for children not yet dead, she paused only once, then said, "Sometimes I did what was asked. Sometimes I did what was needed." The room fell silent. That night, the first formal charge of multiple counts of improper burial was filed, but no charge of murder. There was no conclusive evidence that the children had not been stillborn. Only the items, the patterns, the silence. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered again. Some held candles, others held paper slips, each marked with initials, unsure if they would ever know more. By September 6th, the courthouse storage room had been sealed and placed under 24-hour guard. A full inventory was taken of the objects recovered from both the crawlspace and attic compartment. Each item was logged twice, once by the city clerk and again by a representative from the magistrate's office. Even so, the following morning, a discrepancy was noted. One of the 6 attic bundles had vanished. It was the one marked A. The ribbon that once held it was found folded neatly on the table, undisturbed, as if the contents had evaporated rather than been taken. No signs of forced entry were found. The 3 guards on rotation swore under oath that no one had entered during the night. One claimed he heard footsteps around 3 in the morning, but saw no one when he opened the door. Another claimed he felt a sharp chill through the floorboards just after midnight, though the weather was warm and dry. Constable Fulk, though officially off the investigation, returned to the site when notified of the missing bundle. He stood at the center of the room, staring at the ribbon for several minutes before asking to review the logbooks. When he did, he noted that every other bundle had an entry of the name or letter written beside its contents. But for A, the line had been left blank. The original note, "I gave her every name I knew," was also missing from the file folder. That same day, Fulk visited the Larchwood house once more, unaccompanied. The structure had been partially gutted in preparation for repurposing, with beams exposed, and the garden now leveled into a featureless stretch of dirt. A foreman, Elias Greer, was still on site. Fulk asked him whether anything else unusual had turned up. Greer paused, then reluctantly admitted to a final discovery, made the morning of the 5th but not reported. Behind a dislodged beam in the pantry wall, he had found a box no larger than a book, hidden between the insulation and lath. It contained 10 slips of paper and a small tin vial sealed with wax. The slips were covered in unfamiliar handwriting, more delicate, slightly slanted, and dated between 1846 and 1851. Each note bore the same format: a date, a word or phrase, and a time. Some read, April 2nd, 1846, too early, 2:14 a.m. December 12th, 1847, no breath, 3:03 a.m. June 30th, 1850, second twin, 1:47 a.m. Greer hadn't understood the significance, so he left the box untouched on a beam and closed the wall again. He led Fulk to it. Together they removed the panel, revealing the box precisely as described. The tin vial, once unsealed under the magistrate's supervision, contained a liquid no one could initially identify. Its odor was sharp, with a slight medicinal note, perhaps alcohol-based, perhaps not. It was sent to a chemist in Savannah for analysis. The reply returned 4 days later. The substance was an herbal distillate, commonly used by midwives in the 1830s to dull pain, or, in higher doses, to induce stillness in the womb. Records showed no purchase of the herbs in Edith's name. No prescription, no supplier tied to her home or profession. When presented with this evidence in her cell, Edith asked only one question: "Did you find the blue one?" The guard accompanying Fulk said she had never previously referred to any item by color. Fulk pressed her. "What was the blue one?" She responded, "The one who wasn't born wrong, the one who was taken." Fulk asked by whom. She answered, "Not by me." Following this exchange, Edith refused to speak further for 3 days. Meanwhile, city officials convened a closed-door session to determine the next steps. Charges had been filed, public pressure had risen again, and the Savannah Courier published a new editorial titled, "The Midwife's Garden, What Else Lies Beneath?" But new evidence proved increasingly difficult to process. Every attempt to trace the names or initials in Edith's original ledger met resistance. Church records had gone missing. Cemetery logs were inconsistent. In one case, a child listed as deceased in 1849 was found to have a surviving twin enrolled in school in DeKalb County, but no mention of the deceased sibling appeared in parish documentation. Witnesses began withdrawing again. Mrs. Hargrove, the laundress who had laundered the stained infant clothing, refused a second interview. She reportedly left Atlanta for Augusta 2 days later, leaving behind her lease and possessions. Her final statement was found in a folded note beneath a cushion in her parlor. It read, "They told me never to speak the names. I broke that. Now I go." The pressure returned to the magistrates. Public demand for a conviction was high. But no murder weapon had been found, no verified act of violence, and no verifiable timeline that could place Edith Larchwood as directly responsible for the moment of death in any individual case. And so in late September, The city filed a formal petition to have Edith tried under the lesser charge of gross public negligence, concealment of remains, and falsification of official documentation. The announcement angered many who believed she had committed far greater crimes. But without bodies and without cause of death, the law refused to reach farther. At the jailhouse, Edith's cell was relocated for security. She was placed alone in a lower-level holding chamber where light barely reached. Her meals were brought in silence. Her shawl was taken and replaced with prison cloth. Folk visited once more 2 days before the court convened. He found her seated cross-legged on the floor, her hands folded in her lap. He asked her if she had anything left to say. She nodded. "They brought me children who had no names," she said, "mothers too weak to hold them, families who wanted to forget." Folk asked why she kept the items. Why not bury them with the bodies? She replied, "Because someone should have remembered them, even if it was only me." Then she added, "Some were already gone when they reached me. Some I could not tell." He asked what she meant. She said, "You think you're asking me about the babies. But you're not. You're asking me about the city." The next day, a final inspection of the property was made. Behind a loose brick in the fireplace, officials uncovered one last object, a folded quilt never used, embroidered with 47 small white crosses in perfect rows. No names, no initials, just thread. Each cross was stitched with slightly different tension, some loose, some tight, some faintly unraveling. The quilt was submitted into evidence, but it never reached the courthouse. By the following morning, it had vanished from the records room. No one could explain how or why. The trial of Edith Larchwood began on October 13, 1851, under a grey sky that threatened rain but never delivered. The courthouse was packed before the doors opened. Outside, a line of carriages stretched along Washington Street. Inside, the heat from so many bodies turned the air thick and metallic, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The charges were read aloud in a voice strained by repetition: concealment of human remains, forgery of burial documentation, unauthorized interment, and negligence in the care of minors. The more serious accusations, manslaughter, premeditation, were absent. They had evaporated somewhere between missing files, disappearing artifacts, and officials too weary or unwilling to pursue what the law could not name. Edith entered in silence, her eyes hollow but not unseeing. Her court-appointed advocate, Nathaniel Drew, had asked her repeatedly if she wished to speak in her own defense. She had declined each time. The prosecution began with the physical evidence, the bundles from the attic, the notes, the contents of the wooden chest. But without full remains, without certified cause of death for any child, each exhibit was treated by the court as symbolic and circumstantial. The letters she had written were described as ambiguous in tone and open to interpretive error. Her use of the herbal distillate could not be proven as fatal. Witness after witness described what they had seen, heard, or believed, but the defense argued that belief could not be evidence. Grief, Drew told the court, is a powerful author. It can compose horrors without needing truth. When Edith was asked directly, under oath, why she had kept so many items tied to so many children, she gave only one sentence in response: "Because I was the last person they touched." That sentence was repeated across the courtroom, scrawled into notebooks, whispered into folded hands. By the end of the second day, a shift in tone began to creep through the proceedings. Edith, once described as monstrous in local publications, was now discussed in quieter terms. Her past, though still obscured, began to suggest not sadism but sorrow. Her role in the community had not been clandestine. She had walked the streets, been invited into homes, trusted with the most fragile moments in a family's life. That trust had become her defense. In closing arguments, the prosecution pleaded with the jury to consider the weight of so many missing children, so many unknown graves. But the defense reminded them there had never been a formal complaint before 1851, that many of the families who had once relied on her still refused to condemn her. On October 21st, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Guilty on 3 counts: concealment of remains, unlawful burial, and falsification of documents. Not guilty on all charges related to harm, malice, or intent. Edith Larchwood was sentenced to 6 years at the county asylum in Milledgeville, not a prison. The judge, in his closing remarks, cited her fragile state and social utility historically rendered as mitigating factors. She left Atlanta 2 days later, escorted by 2 marshals and 1 nurse. Her shawl was returned to her for the journey. Public response was divided. Some claimed the sentence was too light, that justice had not been served. Others said the real blame lay with the system that allowed her to operate for so long without oversight, in neighborhoods too poor to demand records or burials or explanations. Within weeks, the Larchwood property was sold again, this time to a coal supplier who flattened the structure entirely. By spring, nothing remained of the house, the garden, or the hedgerows. The street was renamed. The parcel merged with 2 others and absorbed into a lumber depot. No memorial was erected. Over the next 5 years, Atlanta's Office of Public Health implemented new regulations, requiring midwives to register all births and deaths through certified forms, co-signed by a licensed physician or parish clerk. A training program was launched in 1853. 2 years later, the city's first formal morgue was constructed behind Grady House. In 1854, a new law was passed mandating that all child deaths under the age of 1 be reviewed by a medical examiner, regardless of apparent cause. On paper, the reforms marked progress. But in practice, oversight remained patchy, especially in the city's outer districts where records were often lost, names often misspelled, and grief remained silent. Of the families who had given testimony during the hearing, most never spoke publicly again. A few moved to other counties, others slipped into obscurity. Mrs. Myra Lattimore died in childbirth the following winter. Her surviving daughter, when asked years later about the trial, simply said, "Mama said the midwife never raised her voice." Aldous Green, the clerk whose sketches had helped form the basis of the early investigation, left public service in 1852. He moved to Virginia and opened a shop for clock repair. When a traveling reporter from Charleston asked him why he had stopped drawing, he said, "I learned too late that not everything put on paper is safe." Constable Fulk remained in Atlanta another 3 years. He never took another investigative role. His final public action was to donate his personal logbook to the city archive. It included a note on the last page, handwritten and unsigned. "The weight of what was not proven will remain longer than what was." As for Edith, her fate at Milledgeville was recorded only in fragment. An 1853 journal from the asylum's medical superintendent lists her as Larchwood E. quiet, passive, non-violent, engages in small repetitive tasks, has constructed 14 quilts since arrival. There is no record of visitors, no correspondence. In 1856, a line in the intake register is crossed out, and beside it a red ink note. Transferred to convalescent ward, decline noted. Her date of death is not listed. In 1861, when the Civil War reached Georgia, Milledgeville's records were partially destroyed. Whatever remained of Edith's file was lost in the fire that consumed the west wing of the asylum's archives. Only the superintendent's ledger survived, preserved by a clerk who buried it in a tin box beside the chapel. When that box was opened in 1872 during restoration, the clerk's own note was found tucked into the last page. It read, "She hummed the same tune every night before sleep. I never heard the words, but I still wake with it in my ears." By 1857, the Larchwood case had become less a matter of public record and more a private caution. Few spoke her name aloud. Among the city's midwives, an unspoken rule emerged: never bury alone, never record in solitude, never accept a birth without witness. Those who defied these practices found their services quietly rejected. Trust had become procedural. The property itself bore no sign of what had once occupied it. The coal supplier who purchased the land installed a warehouse with thick stone footings and locked its rear entrance with a double iron bolt. Employees noted the soil behind the building remained soft, no matter how many times it was tamped and packed. One foreman claimed the rear wall never stayed dry, even in drought. Another noticed that tools left overnight outside the warehouse were often found rearranged by morning. Nothing stolen, only shifted. He requested reassignment in early 1859. By then, the name Larchwood had faded from city registers. Her house was absent from updated directories. Birth records from the surrounding district began again at 1852, as though the years prior had never existed. But in private homes, old midwife books still bore her initials, scratched faintly into margins or noted in the corner of a linen list. Mothers passed quiet warnings to their daughters. Write the names down, keep the clothes close, never let a stranger carry the child away too soon. One of Edith's few surviving neighbors, Adelaide Krause, moved to Forsyth County in 1855. In a letter to her niece she wrote, "That house was never haunted. It was too full for haunting. It was packed with what no one wanted to say." The letter remained in her family archive until 1914, when it was donated to a historical society in Savannah, misfiled under urban folklore. Edith's possessions, what little were not held as evidence, were boxed and placed in the city archive's basement. In 1860, during a cataloguing update, the inventory was reviewed. Among the boxes was the final item retrieved from her home, a child's nightgown, carefully laundered and pressed, wrapped in wax paper. It bore no stains. The initials embroidered at the hem were unfamiliar, not found in any known record. A clerk assigned to tag it hesitated, unsure whether to assign it a case number or return it to storage. He left it unmarked on the shelf. It was gone by the next inventory cycle. As the city approached the threshold of war, the Larchwood case was no longer cited in official debate, but its effects lingered in the soft mechanics of bureaucracy. Forms changed, oversight expanded. Birth registration became mandatory for all districts, regardless of income or origin. Infant mortality, though still high, was now watched more closely. But in practice, many of the same silences endured. Clerks still made errors. Records still vanished, and poor mothers still buried without stone or ceremony. In 1861, a church ledger from West Atlanta recorded a peculiar service conducted by a visiting priest. It was brief, held in a half-collapsed barn just before conscription swept through the county. No names were listed, only the number 47 and the phrase, "For those unnamed, unknown, and unclaimed." There were no attendees. The priest was never identified. After the war, the area that once housed the Larchwood property became industrial. Coal gave way to lumber, then to machinery. The garden, once full of shallow graves, was paved for deliveries. Children played nearby but never lingered. An old iron lamppost remained at the edge of the site, though no one remembered when it had been installed. City maintenance logs listed it simply as legacy fixture, original purpose unclear. In 1873, during renovations to the depot, workers uncovered a hollow beneath the northwest corner of the lot. Inside was a box, no larger than a drawer, wrapped in cloth. It contained folded papers, a rusted clasp, and the remnants of dried flowers. There was no name. The foreman, unsure whether to report it, placed it in a crate marked "Lost and Found." It was never retrieved. The last known public reference to Edith appeared in an editorial from 1879 in the Georgia Sentinel. The piece unsigned read, "When the city chooses not to remember, it teaches others how to forget. Some women disappeared before they ever arrived. We called them Midwife, but we meant something else entirely. Today, no photographs of Edith Larchwood are known to exist, no likeness, no headstone. Her case remains unsolved in spirit, if not in record. But in a private collection housed in the basement of the Georgia Medical College, there is an unmarked folder, dated 1851. Inside are 3 sketches, yellowed with time. Each shows a different angle of a garden once bordered with white stones. At the bottom of the 3rd sketch is a faint notation, possibly added later. I do not know if she buried the truth, but I know it stayed with her. And in that neighborhood, now little more than a warehouse row, delivery drivers report their radios crackling to static when passing between 2 specific lampposts, even in clear weather. They say it only lasts a few seconds, just long enough to hear something soft and uneven, like a woman humming to herself in the dark. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them, This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.